Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We wanted to have this event tonight, Occupational Storytelling Voices of the AAPI Immigrant Experience, because especially in our current climate right now, and with everything going in our country, we really wanted to explore the way AAPI immigrants navigate identity, belonging, and resilience in their everyday lives, but really want to focus on uplifting stories that really affirm our shared humanity and collective strength, especially with the ongoing challenges faced by the immigrant community. So this is a time for storytelling, really through the lens of occupation, for our panelists to share a little bit about their lives and their histories, their families and their cultures. And so we just really appreciate you joining us this evening. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Karen. I'm Karen Park. I'm president of AAPI OT. We do have a few other leadership on our meeting today. So Danielle Taglakop, she's our vice president of AAPIOT, who's here. Nurali, one of our panelists, she's actually treasurer of our AAPIOT Association as well. And then I also see Shep. Shep is our nomination chair. And one of our founders, let's also recognize, he's one of our founders back in the 90s of the association. And so really appreciate everyone being here. I am going to I also want to acknowledge and recognize, I'm not sure if anyone or everyone is aware, but today is National Immigrants Day. And we didn't plan this, but it turned out, to be really a great day for us to hold this event, to really honor the contributions, resilience, and achievements of immigrants in the United States. Obviously, today we're really shining a light into the API immigrant experience, but wanting to really recognize the many cultures and traditions that make up the history of our nation and really make the nation the way make our nation as beautiful and as diverse and as wonderful as it is. And so I thought that was a nice coincidence. So I wanted to honor that and recognize that as today is National Immigrants Day. And so I do want to jump into introducing our first panelist. So this is going to be, again, a time for storytelling. So I will introduce each panelist as we go along, as they start and introduce them, and then let them just share their stories of being an immigrant or a child of immigrant in the U.S. So our first panelist is Jenny Rivera Villano. So Jenny's a pediatric occupational therapist, educator, and leader dedicated to advancing inclusion, accessibility, and family-centered care. Born and raised in the Philippines, she brings her cultural roots and lived experience into her professional identity. She earned her Master's of Occupational Therapy degree from Loma Linda University and recently completed her post-professional OTD residency at USC Chan, specializing in pedagogy and clinical research while mentoring students and developing sustainable knowledge mobilization resources. So Jenny also serves as Region 2 Director for the Occupational Therapy Association of California. So proudly bilingual and rooted in her Filipino heritage, she integrates cultural awareness into her teaching, clinical practice, and leadership. Beyond her profession, she is a passionate foodie, traveler, and creative who values meaningful occupations. Okay, Jenny?
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. I feel like that already summarized what I wanted to tell you all tonight. So hi everyone. Good evening. My name is Jenny. I am currently a adjunct faculty at USC Chan, as well as a school-based OT. Virtually, I provide services to students up north in California, where I am located in Southern California. Tonight, I wanted to give you a little bit introduction on my background, the early life here as an immigrant. I'm a first generation immigrant from Philippines. I moved here when I was 17. And then I would like to talk about my cultural challenges, identity, and the journey in occupational therapy. I currently, as you heard, I'm currently holding a leadership position in the State OT Association in California, as well as volunteering multiple places. So I'm all over the place, as you can see as well. I do value advocacy and representation, especially in the social media platform. So I also reach out to students and mentor them as they enter the field of occupational therapy. So a little bit on my background. I moved here when I was 17. I graduated high school from LaSalle College. It's Antipolo, which is a city in the Philippines. And coming here from a Filipino background, my parents It's a stereotype, but they did want me to take nursing. I took my anatomy, physiology, microbiology, chemistry, and physics, and all the fun stuff. I even took CNA and home health aid to learn about nursing, to realize that it's not for me. I mean, I salute our nurses and I really admire what they do, but I'll end up crying on bedside. And so I decided I want to help people with their recovery. With that, so fast forward a couple of years later, I spent about 4 years in community college because, navigating the educational system or academia here or academic system here in the US is not something my family is aware of. And I'm the first person to go to college, in the US at least. And so I had to figure out how to take classes, how to apply for financial aid, and so on and so forth. So I spent 4 years in community college. I got my AA in liberal arts, and then transferred to Cal State University Northridge for my bachelor's in kinesiology. Back then, I was gonna go for physical therapy because it is well known or more known than OT. I did not know what OT was. That's the second option for me. And my parents actually did not want me to go for PT as well as what I call it in our language, masajista. Just gonna massage every day. So basically, that's the misconception of therapy world in my culture. And so I had to spend years and years, even until now, as to explain what I do, especially as an occupational therapist and what I do with my family. However, now that I'm able to show them my position in the workforce in the healthcare field, they have accepted and are, I hope they are proud. You know how if you knew about Asian community or Asian culture, my parents did not tell me that they're proud of me or like we never get the gold star or they love us. It's all about service and the unspoken rule that they're proud of you. And so I hope they're proud. um, Now I want to tell you about the story of my mom. She recently had a stroke in May, and I want to share this information because she did not know what OT was until she needed one. So she had OTs in the hospitals and home health. And now that I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, she's urging me to be an OT at the SNF or a hospital. And I told her, and I had to constantly explain to my family what I do, and which I already accepted that fact that we are going to continue to advocate. And I do encourage, if you have students or new practitioners here, that it's never going to end. And so we just have to do our best in spreading the word about occupational therapy. And so I got my bachelor's and I transferred to Loma Linda for my master's degree. I did not get into OT school the first time I applied. Since my anatomy and physiology were not up to par, they're not straight A's because I did not really want to be a nurse when I took them. So I have to retake all my classes. Bottom line with that experience is that, the resiliency and the perseverance and the persistence into getting into this field. A lot of people are discouraged in going to OT school as we hear about in the academic world, the decreased number of enrollment and high demand of OT, and in the pediatric world, high demands of OTs that I pick up kids who have been waiting for OT for 4 to 6 months. So in the early intervention setting, kids who don't have services, imagine what challenges they go through in that area. And then the other challenge is that we don't have much OTs that are in the Asian back or coming from the Asian background or cultural background. And so the challenge for language barrier as well is there. I am in East LA, and so primarily the demographic is Hispanic or Asian. Luckily, as a Filipino, we learn English at an early age. We study English. We learn English when we were at school, and then so coming here, I didn't have to learn much about the language. The only challenge is sometimes I don't get idioms or any slang or phrases that are specific to the Californias. Actually, California, you could call it the United States, but some phrases are specific to California. Another challenge for me too is when I moved here was um, I was supposed to go back to high school, but since I have my diploma, because I was 17 years old, the age discrepancy, because back then we graduate 2 years before the US system. Now they adapted the US system. So I graduated at the age of 16 or 17, and they want me to go back to high school, which I wish I did because should have allowed me to learn more about the culture of this country and the unspoken rule of norms and ethics etiquette when in terms of social participation. But I went straight to college. I was culture shocked because it's community college and a lot of people are way older than me, different background, ethnicity. And I was either if I saw or I aimed to look for the group of Filipinos, but I was kind of in between because either you're too Filipino or you're too Americanized. And so I'm a little bit of both, especially when I pursued my degree in occupational therapy, because as we know, occupational therapy is primarily predominantly a white profession. And so I feel like I needed to change the way I talk, the way I communicate, and the way I assert myself in the field, which helps me now. Going back to my mom's story, when I was communicating with doctors, nurses, a lot of times they hold or withhold information from us because they think we won't understand. Number one, because of the color of our skin and where we came from. I had to constantly tell them every time I meet a new practitioner or a provider, I have to constantly tell them, don't hold back, use jargon on me because I can communicate with you. But it just makes me realize and reflect on what other families are going through who does not have the person to advocate for their family member. Yeah. So talking about my family, I value, we have a close knit a lot. And I grew up with a very strict parents telling me not to have boyfriend until you graduate college and finish your school education, and so on and so forth. And, I value that a lot. However, transitioning into now, I'm on my mid 30s. I kind of have to, if you're in the same page as me, I have to weigh how much I hold on to my Filipino culture in terms of listening to what people say about what I should do with my life, i.e., when to get married, because I want to pursue my OT education, and that requires master's and doctorate, or when to have kids, and navigating the financial areas of it as well, and conversations that we don't really have in our family. And so I still did what I think is best for me. And I did get my degrees. I volunteer a lot. I help out with our OTS, State OT Association here in California as a Region 2 director, where I coordinate events for the Los Angeles area. We are 4 years from pandemic now, and so we are coming back to in-person events. So I hold in-person events for our members as well, and just to give back. Because we have this saying, pakikisama, so being in or kapwa, which is a community care, and we also have this saying of bayanihan, so working together as a community. And so I do that as much as I can, guiding students in my academic field, as well as mentoring students in the State OT Association as they see me as the person, the social media person. I know Karen's our communication person here, but I help with providing content and being that a person, approachable person to help them to, feel welcomed in our state association. So I would like to share or express my gratitude for listening to my stories, from this little girl who once translated for her parents in the in the hospital setting to a woman teaching and leading OT. And this is just the journey of mine and my family's that we'll continue to share in the future.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much. We're gonna hold off any questions for the very end, if that's okay. So thank you so much for sharing about your experience and story. I appreciate it so much. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next panelist. I think next is Nandita. So Nandita is a visionary leader with 30 years of clinical and operational experience developing occupational therapy and clinical training programs at large hospital systems in New York City. So as a project management professional and systems thinker, she's a principle-based decision maker. So a native New Yorker of Guyanese descent, she draws from her lived experiences as a woman of color and a working mother to pave her path and be a motivating influence in creating successful and thriving interdisciplinary work teams, as well as cultural humility practices for patient and student experiences. So she received her BS in occupational therapy at New York University and completed a master's in public health at Columbia University in 2000. Nandita is pursuing a clinical doctorate at Thomas Jefferson University focused on infusing cultural humility practices and organizational structures. All right, Nandita.
Thanks, Karen. I think similar to Jenny, I'm going to kind of speak around the bio. I didn't realize it at the time, but I guess education is a big value of Asian culture. But, thank you to the AAPI community and you, Karen, for the opportunity to share my story about who I am and how my identity has not only shaped my life, but the work as an occupational therapist. I'm a first generation American. My parents and eventually my grandparents immigrated from Guyana. Guyana, for those of you who are not familiar, is on the northern coast of South America next to Brazil and Venezuela. But culturally and historically, it's very much a part of the Caribbean and the West Indian community. My parents are of East Indian descent, and like many immigrant children, I was raised by both my parents and my grandparents, surrounded by a large extended family. Over the years, I kind of watched them immigrate in at different points, like throughout my life. So my family wasn't just who lived under one roof, but it was a web of support, stories, lessons along the way, and traditions that helped me be the person that I am. I grew up in Queens, where I experienced diversity as a daily reality. Queens, New York, is one of the most multicultural counties in the United States. So on my block, neighbors spoke different languages, celebrated different holidays, and shared foods from every corner of the globe. Diversity wasn't something I read about or needed to study. It was literally the air that I breathed. Even so, as a child, I learned early about code switching. I think Jenny, I'm just putting the technical term to it, which I learned very later in life. But as a child, I would speak the language of my family at home, which is a Guyanese Creolese. It incorporates words from African, Amerindian, and Indian languages. But out in the neighborhood, as a child growing up, I spoke with my Queens accent. And in school, I learned to adopt the proper and academic and professional voice that was expected of me. Sometimes I didn't even realize I was switching. And at times it felt like I was wearing like three different skins and trying to make each one fit. I adapted not only my speech, but my behavior, my gestures to fit in. It was exhausting, but felt very necessary to navigate spaces, especially as I grew older. When I started OT school in the early 90s, although I was enrolled, this was a time where you could get your bachelor's in OT, but I was in a program nestled with the majority of students who were getting their graduate degrees. They were getting a master's. And I remember at the time, I knew I felt out of place. But I thought it was because I was younger, because so many of my classmates were, at least like 5 or more years older than me. And, I think I was 18 years old when I started OT school. At that age, it's a big difference. But looking back, I know it was much more than that. This took me years to figure out. It was probably, I don't know, before 2020, but definitely, within the last like 10 years or so. I was one of only 3 people of color in a program of 110 students. I felt different, not because I lacked the skills or the passion, but for the first time in my life, my cultural identity didn't have a mirror in that space. Starting my first job at a very large trauma center in New York City, it felt like coming home. There, the rehab staff and the larger hospital staff were as diverse. It was racially, culturally, linguistically diverse, much like the environment I grew up in Queens. And again, this is just reflecting back now, many, many years later, but I felt at home and I felt I could breathe much more easily. I didn't have to choose which version of myself to show. I didn't have to edit my speech as much, my gestures, as I did in OT school. And that sense of belonging really helped me thrive. I was the good employee, very responsible. I was promoted within the first couple of years to senior. I went on to pursue my master's in public health and was eventually like later recruited to start an OT program in a small community hospital, again in New York City. Once again, the team was diverse. There wasn't many Guyanese people, but there was a Caribbean community. Many of the nurses were Filipino. Many of the residents were from all over the world. So I recognized like the shared threads of culture, and we found like the shared like family values, humor, language patterns, and like that aspiration of, succeeding in America. Even within those diverse spaces, though, I was confronted with moments that reminded me of how deeply ingrained cultural norms can be. I remember teaching a Black patient who was diagnosed with MS. She had very significant hand weakness, and she could not manipulate utensils. And this was back then when you could spend weeks with patients, and she was in the hospital for a while, so we developed a rapport. And I told her, I eat with my hands. And I remember saying, it's fine, it's dignified. Eating with your hands will give you the independence that you're craving, and it will be a great activity to strengthen your hand dexterity. And she lit up. And for the first time, she felt independent and capable. And it was just a goal conquered. The next couple of, she'd been doing it a while, but at a morning rounds, like shortly after, an attending physician asked her, "Oh, why are you eating breakfast with your hands?"
Oh
He
no,
told
oh no, oh no. Ah, got home.
he told
Ah.
he told her that she was doing a great job, but the next step would be learning to eat properly with utensils. I watched her face fall, and I felt something fall in me too. In that instant, I was transported back to my own childhood. My father would tell me, eat with a knife and fork when you're out in public. That's the proper way. And my parents were raised when Guyana was ruled by the British. So they essentially were passing on their lived experience, to me. Um, but in looking back, I realized how deeply the rules of dominant culture, have been ingrained in me, and how often I have had to switch, silently, like editing myself to feel accepted in certain spaces. Years later, this is within the last like 5 years or so, my son was doing a school project. And I finally felt the permission to reclaim that part of myself. His school project was simply to list the foods that he enjoyed eating and how he ate them. So he happens to love um, dal, which is Indian lentils, and freshly made roti, um, which is Indian bread, and you eat it with your hands. And he drew an illustration, and he wrote. He checked off the box because it came attached with like a survey of what utensils do you eat with. And I think for the first time in my life, because as OT practitioners, like we have um, evaluations that they don't list hands as a way of eating. It's always like a spoon, a fork. Maybe if you're lucky, like you'll see chopsticks. But it was literally like the first time I felt like, oh, this is allowed. You're allowed to eat, with your hands. And I could feel the weight of the decades of those unspoken rules like being lifted. And I realized like I wasn't code switching just for acceptance, but I was doing it to avoid shame. Um, Especially in the workplace, when I brought my lunch, I was very conscious about in public not eating with my hands. Now, um, I choose, to honor those practices like very unapologetically. So a little bit more about like looking back on OT school, I realized that, I talked about like how I came later in life to realizing that those years did shape, my early experiences as an OT. But I also realized how fortunate I was back then in the 1990s to have mentors that reflected the diversity that I grew up with. My fieldwork educator was Black. And at my first job at the trauma center, I had the guidance of our next panel presenter, Diana Chen, and so many more. It was a very diverse OT staff. And like I said before, it really felt like home. Their presence mattered more to me than I could have even known at the time, like looking back. They gave me models of confidence, leadership, and authenticity. And they showed me that I didn't have to diminish my cultural identity to succeed. Diana, you'll hear her speak, but she has a very proud Brooklyn accent. And I always admired how true she was to herself, especially like I was always like switching. Um, just like wrapping up, but a few years ago, I was conflicted, whether or not I could find the time to pursue a doctorate degree. And I drew from my grandmother. I have a picture of her. Um, she came to Guyana at around 50 years old. She had raised 7 kids. She had volunteered, but she had never worked. She'd never done paid employment. And she needed to work when coming here, but she wanted to work. And I really drew from that because like she found a way to work and she would still, bake bread. She'd sew our clothes like for special occasions. And she took care of us when our parents went to work. So I really, credit her as a role model. Today I'm proud of my Guyanese roots, my Indian heritage, my upbringing in Queens, and the mentors who have guided me along the way in my career. I am very proud of having to learn how to navigate dominant norms, but staying true and reclaiming my voice, my language, my culture. My hope, just to end off, is as I continue on, this career as an OT, which I love, is to create spaces where others can do the same, where diversity is not just tolerated, but it's celebrated and affirmed, where culture is recognized as a source of strength, not a box to check, and where mentorship of students and early career OTs are provided with permission to bring their whole self, their full voice, and the cultural values, that they can bring into their work as an OT. Cultural identity, I've learned through a very long process, is not something to shed, but it's something to succeed with. It's something we have to bring in every room, in every connection, and in every act of care that we provide. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Sandita. Thank you so much for sharing. That was so beautiful. I just really appreciate you sharing just the intergenerational connections, but also kind of the cross-cultural connections too that we have too. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, and we will have a time for questions at the end. If you have questions for any of our panelists. So next I want to introduce Nirali Maru. She is an occupational therapist and an entrepreneur. After leading her own multidisciplinary intervention center in India, she immigrated to the US, where she rebuilt her career from the ground up. Today, as a school-based occupational therapist and founder of Leafy Vedi, Nirali leads with innovation grounded in evidence-based practices while honoring the timeless wisdom that continues to guide human healing. Okay, Nirali.
Hi everyone, happy National Immigrants Day. I am a first generation immigrant from India. I arrived to the States as an adult. So today I'll share my story of becoming home, my journey between the two worlds. So let's start all the way from leaving home, the heart that boarded the plane. Now, when I left India for the United States, I thought I was chasing opportunity. I packed 2 suitcases, one filled with clothes and the other filled with dreams. Back home, I wasn't just an occupational therapist. I ran my own intervention center, leading a team of multidisciplinary professionals, speech therapists, psychologists, physiotherapists. Together, we built a space where therapy wasn't mechanical, it was human. Families trusted us, children blossomed, and young therapists looked up to me. So when I got my visa, I was thrilled. I thought, this is it, my chance to grow, learn, and bring my impact to the land of opportunity. But I didn't realize that the same key that opened the new door would also quietly take away a part of my freedom. So losing myself and starting from ground zero, when I arrived in America, I thought my experience would carry me forward. Instead, I found myself all over again, starting from zero. My degrees needed to be evaluated, my expertise had to be verified, my leadership suddenly didn't translate. I went from guiding others to feeling invisible in rooms, and that invisibility had layers. I remember early on being asked to conduct a training. Now, it was a topic I knew deeply. My colleagues even said my content was among the best they had seen. But when I began speaking, I noticed quiet giggles, whispers, not about my ideas, but about my accent. That day, I learned that even the clearest message can get lost if the world decides to hear your sound before your substance. I remember going home and practicing in front of the mirror, like softening my R's, stretching out my vowels, trying to make my voice fit in. But no matter how much I practiced, I still sounded like me. And one day I decided that was enough. Because my accent wasn't about English, it was proof that I spoke 2 languages, one English and one of courage. Still, those moments made me question everything: my worth, my belonging, my voice. Now let's move on to a meeting where my voice finally landed. I remember so many meetings where I'd share an idea, something backed by experience, by data, by heart, and yet it would lay flat. People would not politely move on or change the topic. Then a few minutes later, or sometimes even in the next meeting, someone else would repeat the same idea in slightly different words, and suddenly it was brilliant. There'll be nods, there'll be appreciation, there'll be enthusiasm, and I'd sit there, smiling on the outside, shrinking a little on the inside. I started to question myself. Was it my tone, my choice of words, my accent? Was my voice somehow softer or less credible simply because it sounded different? But time taught me something. Silence isn't always defeat. Sometimes it's just the space before understanding catches up. Eventually, I found myself surrounded by a team that saw me, really saw me. They saw the value of not just how I spoke, but what I brought to the table, my clinical insight, my creativity, my deep care for the kids we served. They didn't hear the accent, they heard the ideas. And that changed everything. Because when you're finally in a room where your voice lands, you realize you were never the problem. The room just needed to grow ears big enough to listen. Now the hands that healed when compassion met constraint. So I'll share a story where I was working with a kid in therapy. I saw contrast between two different worlds. I remember working with a child who struggled with handwriting. His wrist kept collapsing as he wrote, so instinctively I placed my hand gently over his to help stabilize his grip. Now, back home, that touch was considered humane, a gesture of guidance and connection. But here, it was flagged as a restraint. I was told, use a tool instead. Now, that moment broke something inside me. Not because of the rules, but because I realized I had entered a world that sometimes valued compliance over compassion. And yet, that moment also planted a seed, a quiet determination to find my way to bring humanity back into the work I loved. Learning the language beyond the words, the turning point. So I began to listen deeply, not just to words, but to tone, pauses, and silence. Like how Jenny shared earlier about that, unspoken language. I started learning not just English, but the language of belonging. I realized that let's catch up soon didn't always mean soon. That you're doing great sometimes meant you could do better, and that you're so confident could be both a compliment and a question. So slowly I began blending what I knew from both worlds, the intuition and compassion from India and the structure and precision from America. I stopped fighting to fit in, and instead I started leading quietly through consistency to empathy and purpose. Now that's when my voice and my confidence return. Making my own map, integration as identity. So eventually I realized I didn't have to choose between two worlds. I could weave them together. My Indian heritage gave me empathy, patience, and sacredness in care. America gave me systems, structure, and innovation. Together, they gave me clarity. I stopped apologizing for my accent. I stopped toning down my difference because I realized the things that once made me feel small were the very things that made me feel whole. And that realization became the foundation for Leafy Veda, a wellness brand. It's a space where ancient Vedic wisdom meets modern wellness. A place that reflects who I am as an occupational therapist at heart and a bridge between two worlds. Through Leafy Veda, I expanded my therapeutic realm. Every ritual we create carries the same intention I have as a therapist to help people feel grounded, connected, and whole. Now let's move on to belonging everywhere, yet to myself. So, most of all, becoming home. Today, I no longer chase belonging, I create it. Yes, I'm an Indian. Yes, I'm an American. but most of all, I'm complete. When I meet international students who feel different, I see them the way I once wanted to be seen. And when I speak to families who feel unseen, I tell them, you don't have to erase parts of yourself to belong. You just have to bring all of them home. Because home isn't a place I left or found, it's something I became. And maybe that's what healing truly is, when your two worlds stop competing and start completing you. So today I stand here as a successful occupational therapist, someone who once started over from ground zero and now serves not only schools, but also in leadership roles across multiple prestigious organizations. I've learned that every challenge carved a deeper strength within me, and I continue to move forward, growing, leading, and building bridges between who I was and who I am becoming. I may have left my country behind, but in every story I tell, every child I help, and every product I create, I carry it within me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nurali. Thank you so much for sharing all that. I really love the way that you're talking about negotiating these identities. I think so many of us probably that resonates with us in our own experiences with our Asian identity and our American identity. So thank you so much, Nurali. Okay, our final panelist. So Diana is our final panelist tonight. So Diana Chen Wang is a second-generation Chinese American who's been an OT for over 35 years. She has vast experience working with adults with physical disabilities, neurological, neurodegenerative, and orthopedic conditions. She has held administrative roles as a director of rehab or director of OT on a brain injury unit and a senior rehab director at ProMedica Senior Care. She's also been teaching for over 25 years and is on the adjunct faculty at New York University, Rutgers University, and Hanover College, as well as being a rehab consultant and cultural liaison at the Kessler Institute of Rehab.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to speak and share about my experience as an Asian American, specifically a Chinese American occupational therapist working in New Jersey. So my experiences is very different than what the folks have shared. I'm a second generation Chinese American, and I don't have a lot of notes. Maybe that's the American side of me, but I feel like I'm at this juxtaposition where I have a lot of Chinese culture with me, but also a very Americanized way of thinking. And so I just thought it would be very interesting to share my experiences as a second generation American, Chinese American. So very quick history. My grandfather came many, many years ago during the railroad times. He immigrated to the West Coast in California, and he and his friends were instrumental in helping with building the railroads. When that was done, he felt that there was a lot of discrimination against Chinese Americans, and he felt that that was not a place that he would want to settle with my grandmother. So he actually, him and my grandmother moved to the East Coast because he had a cousin who had a laundromat in upstate New York. And he said, you know what, it's not as bad here. Discrimination is not as bad here. You should come with your wife. P.S. He had 4 kids that he left in China. He had come with my grandmother. Well, he came first, and then he brought my grandmother over so that he could establish a household and then bring his other kids over. In the interim, my dad was born in upstate New York. So he went to school there. He was fully immersed in the American culture. My dad was able to read and write English. He went all the way up into high school until my grandfather said that he was, because of his age, he was drafted into World War II. Fortunately, he was not able to serve because the war was ending by the time my dad was ready to go into combat. So my dad has the whole American experience. He befriended a lot of Caucasians. And so his language, if you think my accent was bad, my dad has a very strong American Brooklyn accent. And then he actually had some friends who were in lower New York, in Brooklyn, and they said, you know, we want to establish and have a laundromat here. Would you consider doing that? So back in those days, the Chinese were either working in a restaurant or opening a laundromat. So true to the Chinese American experience, that's what my dad and my granddad did. So they moved from upstate New York to what they call downstate New York into Brooklyn, New York. And so that's where I was born. I was born and raised there. My Let me take it 2 steps back. So after my dad came out of the army, my grandparents felt like it was time for him to get married. So what did they do? They chose a wife for him back in China. My dad had to go back to China, meet my mom, decided, hey, this is somebody that I would be willing to marry, got married there, but he left my mom there so he could come back here to establish himself, make money so he could go back and bring my mom over. So again, my dad was similar to my grandfather in that they were both wanting to come make their living, they called it their golden mountain, their fortune in the United States so that they can go back and then bring their wives over. So after my mom came, my dad had his 4 kids. But it was through that I was able to, I guess, grow up in Brooklyn. And so in a very Irish and Italian neighborhood of Brooklyn. And so folks who know Brooklyn, it was in Bay Ridge. So P.S., me and my sisters became very Americanized. And so even though my dad was it was Chinese American and he was raised very Chinese with my grandparents, my mom was fully immersed in the Chinese culture. So we had that blending of both of us. So growing up, going to school for lunch, I would have like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, cold cuts, and tuna fish sandwiches. But when I come home at night, my mom would make Chinese food. So my dad being very well versed in what was expected with the American education system, helped with reading. He helped with, just the whole scholastic piece. And my mom was there to be our caretaker and taught us, the importance of sewing and cooking and all the other Asian or Chinese aspects that were important for us growing up. So being very Chinese, but also being very American, I felt helped me as an occupational therapist. However, that didn't go without a lot of conflict, right? So because of my background, I felt that there was a lot of Chinese cultural things that helped shape me as an OT when I first came out. So for instance, being an occupational therapist, it's very similar to Jenny. My mom had no clue what that was. At first, my mom predestined one of her 4 girls to become a doctor. When I went through junior high and high school, I was looking to become pre-med actually, because my 2 older sisters, not the greatest in science, and they were like, that's not for us. So in high school, I had to go for observation hours, right? Because you needed it for prereqs. It looked great on the college application, but there were no volunteer experiences or observation with physicians or nurses. A lot of it had to do with either physical therapy or occupational therapy. So they placed me with an occupational therapist. And I remember when the volunteer office was telling me, oh, we're going to put you with an occupational therapist in our geriatrics ward. I was like, what is that? I don't want to help people find jobs, right? But it was through that experience that I was exposed to OT and realized, hey, this is actually better than being a doctor, right? Because we get to spend so much more time. Because it was in a psychogeriatric ward, I was able to see the benefits of using activities and seeing meaningful activities and engaging with these clients, and really seeing the importance of how activities really brought fond memories and long-term memories, and just evoked emotions in a lot of their clients. So I realized, you know what, don't want to become pre-med anymore, much to my mom's major disappointment, right? Because as a Chinese American, or probably a lot of Asian cultures, like I think Jenny had shared as well, our parents had wished, because they didn't want their kids to have such a hard life working in a laundry. She wanted one of her kids to at least go into pre-med. She was very disappointed. She was very discouraged. But after coming out of OT school and graduating, she realized that, well, okay, at least it's in health and not like my other sisters who are doing different things, right? So, but still, within my American and Chinese culture, it really helped shape how I became a therapist, right? So with my Chinese culture, there was like an emphasis on working hard and hard work. And when you have questions or challenges at work, you don't question. You just put your head down and you just work. And so that was something that was taught to me early on, and which is very different from the American culture, right? Not to say anything negative about it, but the American culture is, if you see an issue, you see something that might be questionable, you question it, right? And so as a therapist and as a Chinese American occupational therapist, I was torn, right? I wanted to work hard, didn't want to make waves, but if I felt like there was an injustice, what do I do? Do I question? Do I not question, right? Likewise, when we're working, in terms of with authority. So in the Chinese culture, you respect authority. You don't question your authority. Whatever your boss says, whatever your supervisor says, you do whatever he or she wants. But in the American culture, if you don't agree with your supervisor, what do? You question. So again, I was very torn. But it was through my more of the Chinese culture, right? That shaped me, that made me work hard, made me not really challenge or question authority. That, as Nandita said, I was able to be promoted quite quickly from being a staff to a senior to a director. And it was through that I'm able to help others, right? Help supervise others and try to bring other OTs into the fold and try to encourage them to aspire to do better and work harder. But also, just even as a clinician, I felt this shaping between my Chinese culture and my American culture, specifically with my ADLs, right? So in our Chinese culture, modesty was a big thing in terms of bathing, dressing. You don't really see other people naked, right? But in OT, that's like the crux of a lot of our ADLs is dressing, bathing. How do I marry the two, right? Respect their space, and still help facilitate their functioning. And so just having to overcome that was a little bit of a challenge. Likewise with how we treat our patients, how we treat elders. I think a lot of my Chinese culture plays into how I relate to a lot of our patients or my clients, because we always, as Chinese growing up, we were always told to respect our elders, that we would call folks Mr. or Mrs. We would never be on a first name basis. But yet I noticed with the American culture, it's not a problem to address a patient or a client by their first name. So again, between my Chinese culture and my American culture, trying to bring the two together in terms of working with patients and clients, in terms of how I work terms of my work ethic, in terms of how I supervise, in terms of how I attend meetings and present myself as the director of OT or a rehab director. I'm very mindful of who I am and trying to bring both cultures together so that I'm able to, I guess, just make sure that they see me as well as see me as a Chinese American occupational therapist. So I feel like as a second gen Chinese American, that has been my challenge. And growing up, just having both of those cultures has helped shape me as a therapist, as a supervisor, as a director, and now as a professor. It enables me in terms of incorporating, again, that juxtaposition, right? Incorporating both cultures so that I'm able to, which reflects on who I am, what I am, and how I perform and what I do. So, yeah, I guess that's just something that I wanted to share. I'm not sure if you guys are working with folks who are also second gen, or I guess in West Coast, there's a lot of third gen. Just being mindful of that, whether they're your clients or they're your staff, or if they're your students, for those of you who are in academia, and it's not just the Chinese American, but I'm sure the other Asian Americans, there's a lot of second and third gen. Like, how do we work with them so that we can allow them to express themselves, allow them to work, allow them to achieve their goals, right? Whether it's their patient goals, or as students, their student goals, or as workers, as their workers' goals, because I think having both cultures is a benefit, but sometimes we're torn. And so, or they're torn, and how do we help facilitate that, right? As folks who have had that experience. So I guess I just wanted to share my experiences, and yeah, just again, that's the American part of me. I speak with my hands, which is very Americanized of me. But again, yeah, that's just what I wanted to share with you guys.
Thank you, Diana. Is that an American thing? I speak with my hands also.
I heard it was a very Italian thing. Growing up with my Italian friends, that was like a very big thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Diana. I think we really appreciate the second generation voice. It really does speak to the immigrant experience in a different way, but still is, really highlighting some of these, the challenges and kind of the strengths of being part of U.S. or American society, but still kind of negotiating some of these identities too. So really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, and it's hard because, growing up, I guess because I was in school, the American side pretty much dominated my Chinese side. And my mom would get really mad at us. She wanted to send us to Chinese school, which was like a big thing growing up. And we fought. A lot of my friends who were Chinese American went to Chinese school so they could read and write. I can't read and write because my dad, being American, was like, they don't really need to do that. You know what I mean? But my mom was like, okay, if they don't go to Chinese school, then they all have to take piano lessons. And so growing up, I did the dreaded piano lesson because it was either that or Chinese school. And I'm like, okay, American school is like more than, enough. So, again, that whole juxtaposition of, and there was a lot of conflict because my dad was so American and my mom was so Chinese. And from what I understand, he was not keen on going back to marry my mom. But there were not a lot of Chinese women in the United States back in the 40s. Right. So my grandparents, being very Chinese, said, listen, you're the only son. You have to marry a Chinese girl so that we can have a Chinese son and carry on the Chen name, which never happened, by the way. But
and there's a lot to unpack even there.
A lot to unpack. And so growing up, it was such a challenge. Right. And then, another thing that my mom or something that Chinese, and I don't know about the other Asian cultures, like the hugging, kissing, like it's like when you greet somebody, not a thing, right? And so but that was something, but then growing up in a very Italian neighborhood, when I would go visit my friend's mom, go to their house after school, their moms were hugging me and kissing, like greeting me. And I was like, what is this? But then that's how I ended up growing up. And then my cousins who are in like Pennsylvania and the outer, in Texas, that's how they greet each other. Because again, we're all very Americanized, being second gen. So, you know, so
Sorry, Diane, I don't want to cut you off, but we're right at
okay, sorry.
our time. But I do want to leave a couple minutes for questions or final thoughts for wrap up. So does anyone have any questions for our panelists? I just appreciate all of you just sharing your stories, and there's so much I think that we could continue to discuss.
Yeah.
For sure. And Jenny is sharing a little bit. Jenny is sharing her her handles on social media. Feel free to share that as well if anyone is interested in connecting. But any questions, thoughts, final words, final things to share? Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you everyone for being here. This is something that we really wanted to share with